What a great lead into our sermon today. We serve a holy, holy, holy God. There's none like him. He's the God that dwells in unapproachable light. And yet, like Matt said leading to that song, he stoops down in love to us. So let's pray with that on our hearts, this holy, holy, holy God who wants to meet with us this morning. Let's pray. Lord, we love you. We're in awe that you, the Lord of the universe, would stoop down and love to us. And you do so consistently. God, may you do that today. Stoop down in love as we look at your word. Speak to us through it and help us know what it means for us to be people that want to follow you. God, we love you. We ask for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Feel free to grab a seat. Well, we've been in our series going through the book of Genesis, and we find ourselves all the way in chapter 15. It's been a real thrill for me to get to preach through this book that, we often refer to, maybe even read a lot, but don't have many chances to preach through. And it feels like every week we're going through like the most important text we've ever been through, and this week feels no different to me. We're in Genesis 15. A lot has happened. I'll remind you in a second, but what we're going to see this morning is Abram. And by the way, I'm already calling it. If I'm going to say Abraham, I'm going to mess it up at least like 6 times. So just go easy on me. He's still Abram in this point. He'll be Abraham later. I'll probably call him Abraham, but you'll know who I'm talking about. But this morning, we're going to see Abram and God relating to one another. And we're going to see 2 main things. We're going to see this relationship between Abram's doubt and then God's grace, and then Abram's even more doubt and God's covenant. So, without further ado, let's just jump right in. We'll be in chapter 15. We'll start in verse 1. It goes like this. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Now, what I like about how this verse starts is it reminds us that we never read any verse of the Bible in isolation. We have these great 2 words, after this, which should beg the question, what's the after this? What's the this that this is coming after? So let's just remind you. A week ago, Mark talked about Genesis 12, where God makes a covenant with Abram. And then a lot happens in chapters 13 and 14 that I just want to real quick fly over. In 13, Abram has this nephew, Lot. And both Abram and Lot's families are getting really big. They're growing in wealth, and they just have a lot of people. And they get to a place where the people tending all the flocks and herds and possessions are starting to quibble and fight with one another because their possessions and flocks had grown so large that they needed more land than they could have just together. So Abram and Lot come together and they say, we should actually part ways, not in like a mean, way that we're mad at each other. We just need some space. And so Abram, being the nice guy that he is, says, hey, Lot, you pick first. And Lot picks this great land. It's in the plains of the Jordan Valley, and it's right by this town called Sodom, and that's where Lot goes and settles. And Abram settles near Canaan, and at the end of in the very end of chapter 13, God has this great scene where he takes Abram aside and he says, look out to the east, the west, north, south. All of this will one day be your inheritance. So then in chapter 14, they're in their separate places, but war breaks out in their communities. There's all these rival kings that are out there, and Lot actually gets taken prisoner. Well, Abram hears about this. He's upset that his nephew is taken prisoner. So Abram rallies this little army, and he goes and gets Lot back. And the king of Sodom in that time was so thankful that Abram rescued Lot and brought him back to Sodom that he tries to give all these spoils of victory to Abram. And at the very end of chapter 14, Abram has this incredible line where he says, I'm not going to accept anything from you. I don't want any glory to go to you. I don't want you to be able to say, I made Abram great. See, Abram had inherited these promises, and he wanted the world to know that his greatness would come directly from God and not from anything else. So he turned down these great spoils of victory so that it would be unimaginably clear that it was God who was responsible for his success. And so now we find ourselves in chapter 15, but obviously Abram is afraid because God comes and says, don't be afraid. Now, why would he be afraid? Okay, you can go back. We don't need that one yet. Why would he be afraid? Now, just as a reminder, Abram had just probably put a target on his back. He got his little army, he went and got Lot back, but he had made some enemies along the way. So he might be scared because of that. And he might have been regretting giving away the spoils of victory. He might have been thinking, all that money, I really want the credit to be tied to God, but man, it'd be nice to have more money, right? That's usually the way things go. And so he might be a little nervous about the decisions he has made. And Abram is met by God in this great vision. That phrase, the word of the Lord came to Abram. It is so significant. If you flip, a bunch of pages past Genesis, you get to the books of the prophets, like Jeremiah and Hosea and some of those other guys. And often you'll see those words, the word of the Lord came. But where we are in the Bible, these are really rare. That phrase, the word of the Lord came, only happens twice. And we're going to see them both. They're like a couple verses apart. But it's this incredible, unique, direct way God comes to somebody with his presence. Now, only 2 times in the whole first 5 books of the Bible, those are pretty significant books, and they only happen to Abram, and they happen right back to back in the text we'll look at this morning. So, just in case you're keeping track at home, the word of the Lord came does not happen to Noah. It doesn't happen to Isaac. It doesn't happen to Jacob, Joseph, or Moses. But it happens with Abram. And it happens in very significant way. And what happens, we are learning about how God deals with fear and how God deals with doubt. See, he doesn't get frustrated when people get afraid. He had made these great promises to Abram. He was already doing incredible things in Abram's life, and Abram was still scared. He felt militarily vulnerable. And so what does God promise? He says, I will be your shield. He feels economically vulnerable. And God says, I will be your very great reward. Now, I don't know how you think God deals with fear, but here we get a little insight into how he's dealing with Abram's fear. He doesn't say, you fool, I can't believe you're not getting this. He doesn't say, here I am, like, what else can I do? I'm here in a vision. And you're still afraid. He deals with the fears of Abram gently and kindly. And he offers his presence. But notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't say, hey, I know. Now, when Abram won this military victory, he only had 318 soldiers. That doesn't sound like a lot to me. And when God says, I will be your shield, what he doesn't say is, I'm going to make your army 10 times bigger. All he says is, I'll be your shield. And when Abram's worried about giving up all this wealth, God doesn't say, hey, you turned on all that wealth, so I'm going to give you 10 times more wealth. No, he says, I will be your very great reward. What God is doing for Abraham is meeting him in his fears and giving him himself rather than the thing Abram thought he might have needed to not be afraid. I think we're learning something really profound about how God deals with our fears. He doesn't always give you the thing you think you need to not be afraid, but he readily gives you himself. He says to Abram, I can see you're afraid. I'm going to be your shield. I'm going to be your reward. Dramatic, amazing. How does Abram respond? But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Now, I think we learned something great about doubt here in response to how Abram reacts. God meets Abram. He says, I'm going to be your shield. I'm going to be your great reward. And Abram doesn't say, that's amazing, thank you, that's exactly what I need. What does he say? He says, hey, remember all those promises you made me? I'm doubting that you can actually do them. Remember when you said I'd have children of my own, that my seed would inherit these promises? I don't really understand how that's going to get done. Abram responds to God in doubt. You would think after these great promises that Abram felt like $1 million. Or I don't know it probably wasn't bucks back then. Maybe he felt like 1,000,000 shekels or whatever the conversion is. Maybe he felt like 30 oxen. I don't know. But I think he should have felt pretty good. But what does Abram do? He says, what can you give me? I remain childish. He was being childish. I remain childless. You have given me no children. Now, you got to imagine that Abram should be feeling good, but he's not. And God might be getting a little frustrated. But what we see is that God, again, remains calm and patient. I think this is good news. I certainly in my Christian life have faced fear. I certainly in my Christian life have faced doubts. it is nice to see how God responds. He has started this pattern of responding kindly and gently, but not letting this doubt languish. He's going to deal with it. But if it's any consolation, this is the text. We're about to get to it in a couple minutes here, where Abram's belief and faith and trust in God is going to be honored. And yet, it is marked by doubt. So if in your own faith life you have some doubts, take heart. That does not disqualify you. That doesn't make you a second-class Christian citizen. Faith and doubt can go hand in hand. But it's important to go with God, to go to God with them. See, here's how God responds. And by the way, it says this later on in Jude 22. And we'll see, this is kind of codified. It says, be merciful to those who doubt. And we get to see that real time. Genesis 15, verses 4, God says, it says, then the word of the Lord came to him. Second time we've seen that phrase. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. God doesn't punish. He doesn't get harsh or frustrated. He almost, you can imagine him putting his arm around Abram and saying, let me just remind you of what I'm going to do. I will make your seed inherit my promises. And finally, he sees this faith in Abram, and he says this in verse 6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abram brings doubt. God brings grace. Now, what does this mean? Abram believed. That just means to trust, have confidence in, rely in. It's this, and by the way, if you looked at the verb form, it means ongoing. This isn't like the first time Abram had faith. You've got to remember, Abram had already done some pretty amazing things. God had said, hey, leave your home and your family and your land and your wealth and just start wandering and I'll tell you where to go. And he was like, okay, I'll do that. That sounds like faith and trust. But here we see this marked point where he believes God. Now, you might have heard me say Abram believed in God. That's not what it says. It says he believed God. Now, of course, Abram believed in God. But I don't think that was the real challenge, right? Because God was showing up in this dramatic vision. That would be, I mean, maybe you could not believe God if he was, or believe in God if he shows up in that dramatic way. Fine, that's possible. But I don't think that was a real challenge here. Abram is hung up on taking God at his word. God had said, I'm going to do all this incredible stuff. I'm going to make your seed inherit these promises. I'm going to give you this incredible land. I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And what finally, it says in verse 6 is Abram believed, not in the Lord, he believed the Lord. The challenge here was to believe that what God was saying was true. I don't know if you've ever found yourself in that position, but it happens. You hear a promise of God, and you think, can I buy that? And here, that is what is credited. Abram simply trusts that what God is saying is true. And what happens? It is credited to him as righteousness. That righteousness is right conduct, and that word credit, it just means to make it count for something. When I went to seminary, we had a practical requirement for ministry. You're supposed to go be a chaplain in a hospital or work in a church. But when I went there, we were really busy, and I had worked in a church before. And so they had an agreement where my previous work experience was credited as this requirement in my program. They made something count for something else. Here, Abram has righteousness, right conduct, credited to his account because of his belief. Friends, we are seeing the gospel. Abram is given a righteousness outside himself, credited to his account because of his belief. He didn't have to work for it. He didn't have to earn it. It was given as a gift of free grace. Now, this is such an important verse that there are passages, huge passages in the New Testament that help explain this. So we're going to look at one. But I want to give you a little image of what we're doing. There's a great theologian named B.B. Warfield. And he talked about the Old Testament as this really ornately decorated room, but it was really dark in there. It was dim. And what the New Testament does is not move or add the furniture. It just turns up the lights a little bit. B.B. Warfield says this. He says, the Old Testament may be likened to a chamber richly furnished but dimly lighted. The introduction of the light brings into it nothing which was not in it before, but it brings out into clearer view much of what was in it, but was only dimly or not even at all perceived before. He goes on to give an example. He says, the mystery of the Trinity is not revealed in the Old Testament, but the mystery of the Trinity underlies the Old Testament revelation, and here and there almost comes into view. Thus, the Old Testament revelation of God is not corrected by the fuller revelation that follows it, but only perfected, extended, and enlarged. I'll tell you why this is so important. You know, there's like whole heresies in the early church of thinking that the God of the New Testament was a different God than the God of the Old Testament. It's so important to know that God didn't, wasn't the Old Testament was like the first draft. It was bad. He came off a little angry and mean, and so he wrote another version, chapter 2 or section 2 or wherever you want to call it, and he's like, I'm going to go with like the radical love thing in this. Maybe it'll take off more. That's not what it is. The Old Testament is preaching the same God as the God of the New Testament. We just don't have as much light. We come to the New Testament on the other side of the cross, on the other side of God's death, resurrection, and ascension back into heaven. That is what we read with that light. And so many of these themes we see in the Old Testament become more clear. So when we read a verse like, and God saw Abram's faith and credited to him as righteousness, Paul, when he went to pen some of the New Testament, said, this is so important that I need to explain it a little bit. So just hang with me. This is how Paul digs into this theme. This is the interpretation of the Old Testament found in the New Testament. Again, he's just turning the lights up a little bit, not adding anything new, but showing us what it means. We're going to turn to Romans 4. And again, by the way, when we talk about context of Romans 4 isn't just Romans 3. The context of Romans 4 is Genesis 15 as well. We look at the whole scripture when we look at any scripture. This is what it says. He says, what shall then we say that Abraham, see, I almost corrected it the other way. I don't even know where I am right now. It's fine. Now he's Abraham. What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? This exact scene we're talking about, this is what Paul's talking about. He says, if in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. It goes on. Now to the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but as obligation. However, to the one who does not work, but trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. Paul is turning the lights up on Genesis 15:6. He's saying this wasn't a work that God was meriting or crediting to his account as righteousness. Abram believed God. And that belief, that trust that God, what God said was going to happen and was true, was credited as righteousness. And by the way, the subject in this, is not just God. He says, the one who does not work, but trusts God who justifies the ungodly. It's not just that you don't have to work. It's that God works in spite of your ungodliness. Abram was not getting everything right. He is kind of a model of faith, but he's a model of faith because he gets a lot wrong. And here Paul is saying, God justifies the ungodly, not just people that seem like they have it all together, like Abram. He goes on, he says, David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against them. And then he brings it all to a close a bunch of verses later, and he says this. And I want you to hear this. This is to you. He says, the words, it was credited to him, were not written for him alone, but also for us, to whom God will credit righteousness. For us who believe in him who raised Jesus, our Lord, from the dead. That is the gospel. It started way back when in Genesis 15, not by a different mean, angry God, but by the same loving, gracious, compassionate God we gather to worship every week. Those words, it was credited to him count for you. All of those who believe that he raised Jesus from the dead. Friends, Abram is getting a whiff of the gospel. He is giving a righteousness that comes from outside himself, credited to his account in spite of how he gets things wrong. That is the same promise that you and I get to inherit. Not because of stuff we do, but because of our great God. Well, we got to hurry up. We got a lot more to cover. So it goes on as we see this kind of gospel weaved in the middle. The conversation goes on. He also said to him, this is God, he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and take possession of it. So he's reminding Abram of his name and what he's done. And how does Abram respond? Again, Abram was scared at first. Then he was a little doubtful, and God's bringing in grace. Surely he'll get it right this time, right? Verse 8. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? More doubt. In the beginning, his doubt was centered on God. How can I know you're going to do what you said you were going to do? Here, Abram's doubt is about himself. He's saying, how can I know that I'm going to take possession of it? You see, everybody that doubts God, it's not just, I don't know if God exists. Sometimes people are like, hey, I'm clear on the whole God thing, but I don't know how he could use me. I don't know how he could use someone who has my past. I don't know how he could use someone who has my present. You know, go down the list. Whatever your hang-ups about yourself are, they can breed doubt. How could God do something great through me? Maybe I don't feel smart enough, or I don't work hard enough, or I don't feel brave enough or spiritual enough. Maybe you even think you're just like, yeah, I struggle to get the whole like daily time with the Lord thing down. How could God use me if I feel like I'm still like have the training wheels on this bike of faith? You know, by the way, you might think like, I mean, and remember all that stuff I did? How could God use someone like me? And how does the Lord respond? He sees right in Abram's heart, just like he can do to you. And he sees that self-doubt. And you know what he does? He does something wild. He says, so the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. It almost sounds like the setup to a bad joke, right? Like, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram. They all walk into a bar or wherever, under the altar. I don't know what you do back then, okay? It seems kind of confusing, but Abram seems to know what's going on. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half, obviously. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. Now, there is no conversation. He just says, go get a bunch of animals, and Abram's like, oh, we're doing the cut in half thing? Totally, I'm on it, right? Now, that would not have been my instinct if I was going to get some animals from my flock, but Abram seems to know. What is happening is God, we always say make covenant. If you look at the Hebrew, God is cutting a covenant with Abram. Now, they didn't have like pen and paper and, sign on the dotted line. This is how they made agreements. I had a plumber come in and fix a leak in my house the other day. I was going to try this. I was going to like get old Bessie in the back, cut her in half and be like, we're doing this, right, plumber? Right? Want to walk through with me? No, when he said, you got a leak and I'll fix it, and then he fixed it and I looked at the work and I said, yeah, you did a great job. I signed on the dotted line saying, I see what you did and I'm committing to pay for it. We're in an agreement. In the Old Testament, this is how they made agreements. What they did is they divided those animals in half, and what would often happen is, like imagine it's me and my plumber. He's saying like, you got a leak, I'm going to fix it. It's going to be $600. And I said, yeah, that sounds fair. Let me go get the animals. We'd cut them in half, and I always envision it like we were like interlacing fingers, holding hands, me and the plumber, but maybe that's just my own hang-ups. But we'd have the animals on either side, and he and I would walk right through. And what we were doing is we were agreeing. He's agreeing, I'm going to fix it. And I'm agreeing, I'm going to pay for it. But it's not just that. We're not just in the positive. In the negative sense, we are saying, and if I don't fix your leak, may I be cut in two just like this animal. Kind of intense for plumbing, but just, go with me. And I am saying, and if I don't pay, may I be cut in two. That's how you made an agreement back then. Again, shortage of pen and paper. I guess it was like papyrus and quill. I don't know what it was, but that's how they made covenants. This is what God says to the prophet Jeremiah about a covenant just like this. In Jeremiah 34:18, he says, those who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two and then walked between its pieces. The stakes are high in an agreement like this. Abram is told to go get some animals. He cuts them in half. He knows what's going to happen. But before this covenant is ratified and sealed and signed and delivered, something happens. This is what happens. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried in a good old age. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." They're getting ready to cut this agreement. And this is not just Abram getting sleepy in the middle of, a boring conversation. God brings this thick and dreadful darkness over him and puts him in a deep sleep. It's the same language that is used when Adam goes into a deep sleep so that his rib could be pulled out to form Eve. It's the same sort of deep spiritual slumber. And God is kind of giving him a sense of how this agreement's going to go. And what does he say? You can be certain that for 400 years you'll be enslaved and mistreated. And yes, there'll be blessing on the other side. But you know what you can take to the bank? For 400 years, you'll struggle and suffer. That is what will happen to your people. But on the other end, they'll have great possessions. And you'll be buried at a ripe old age. But you can count on it, that for 400 years, your descendants will be as people without a country, and they will be mistreated and enslaved. This is why I can't help but just kind of scoff at things like the prosperity gospel. I don't mean to knock it as often as I do, but I just think about it. You read a text like that, and just go, there is not this one-to-one correlation of faith and things going well and easy and avoiding hardship. And I think God just wants to be clear about the way life's going to go. Not because he's a meanie and not because he wants to lower your expectations. I think he just says, it is not a this for that relationship. Faith is not a cheat code to an easy life. Listen to how this theme is carried throughout the scriptures. In 1 John 3:13, we read this: "Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you." And you might think, well, that was just John. I mean, John's important, but he's not Jesus. Oh, okay, listen to the words of Jesus. "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." And how does this land? Okay, theoretical. If the world hates you, listen to this tale about Paul's life from the book of Acts. "Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city." The place he was stoned, went back in. "The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. They preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith." What were their words of encouragement? "We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God," they said. Friends, the Christian life isn't always up and to the right, and how things are here and now. You will end up in the right place. I promise you. God promised that. But it might be hard. It might be challenging. And oh, by the way, as Jesus is saying these things and allowing these things to be recorded in Scripture, listen to how he refers to them. In John 16, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." What did God do when Abram was afraid? "I'm your shield. I'm your great reward." What does Jesus do here? "In me you will have peace." Not in your outside circumstances. Not in the barometer of your life. If your bank account's up and things are going well, it doesn't mean that's where your peace will come from. You will have peace in me. And why is that so important? So that you're not surprised, and so that you have the right expectations about life, and maybe most importantly, so that you know if things go south, it's not your fault. I can't tell you how many times in my many years of pastoring, whether over big stuff or small stuff, losing your keys to losing a loved one, people will say to me, I must have done something wrong. That's why this is happening. That's why I lost my loved one. That's why this kind of small thing, that's why I can't find a parking space. I've heard it all on the spectrum. I must have done something wrong. Jesus one day, he sees a blind man, and a couple of people come to him, and they say, why is that man blind? It must be because of either his sins or his parents' sins. Somebody must have done something wrong. Somebody must have done something wrong that this guy's paying for. You know what Jesus said? That's not the way it works. Neither. It's so that God's glory can be displayed in him, because God will bring him out on the other side of this. The reason why I think God says, you know what you can take to the bank, Abram? For 400 years, your descendants will be mistreated and enslaved. And I think and then by the way, I'll bring you out on the other side. And what God could have included in that tale is, and by the way, I'll rescue you from that. But then you'll turn your back on me time and time again, and I'll pull you back. I think this whole conversation is going on is so that we know that we don't have a this for that relationship. We started to find that out in verse 6. Abram believed, and it was credited as righteousness. It didn't mean he got it right. It meant he was counted as having got it right. That's not the relationship we have with God. We have a relationship of grace. And do you know how I know that? It's because how God seals this covenant. That we're right in the middle. He cuts the animals in half. He falls into this sleep. God is saying it's not going to be a this for that relationship. And how does it end? When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot. Sorry, I might get emotional, but it's not because I'm into earthen pottery. A smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day, the Lord made or cut a covenant with Abram. Think back to me and the plumber. I'm not walking through those animals myself. I'm making sure the plumber comes with me so that we're both on the hook. And when covenants were made in that day, when there's like a lord and a vassal, anytime there was a power inequality, the guy with the power often chose not to walk through so that he could be not on the hook for the consequences. Because he was just using his power to get what he wanted. So he said, hey, you walk through. So if you don't keep up your end of the bargain, you're going to be cut in two, but I'm going to take a pass. If it was ever just one person walking through, it was always the person on the underside of power with the disadvantage. This fire pot and this blazing torch, this is God. It's hearkening all the language of how God shows up. On Mount Sinai, he shows up as smoke and fire, just like we see in this passage. When God leads his people through the wilderness, he shows up as a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire. This is God showing up. Only him and him alone are walking through the cut up animals. Most covenants say, hey, if you get it wrong, you're going to be cut in two. And if I get it wrong, I'm going to be cut in two. Here, what God is saying is if I get it wrong, I'll be cut in two. And if you get it wrong, I'll be cut in two. This is the gospel. God ensuring both sides of it. And you might be thinking, I can imagine me being cut in two, but how in the world could God be cut in two? Thousands of years later, another thick and dreadful darkness fell upon the land in the middle of the day. And Jesus was cut to hang on the cross. And as he gasped for air, the last thing he said was, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus was cut down and cut off so that you wouldn't need to be. And you could be whole. That is the gospel. You think it's impossible. You look back at this covenant, you say, there's no way you could actually make good on this God. You're God. What could happen to you? It happened to Jesus. To Abram, God says, if I don't keep this covenant, I'll be cut in two. And if you don't keep it, I'll be cut in two. And in Jesus, he says, you didn't keep up your end of the bargain. And I'll be cut in two so that you could be whole. That is the gospel, and it starts all the way in Genesis. Let's pray. Lord, Isaiah 53 said, you were cut off from the land of the living. It seems crazy. The one who made the land of the living could be cut off from it. And yet you pulled it off. And you didn't do it just to show how great you were. You did it because of us. You wanted us to be whole and with you. You did not want us to be cut down and cut off. And so you sacrificed the life of your son, Jesus Christ, and allowed him to be cut down and cut off so that we could be with you. Jesus, we're in awe of you. We're in awe of what you've done on our behalf. It's hard to even get the words out without getting a little emotional about how much you love us. But you do. And so what I ask is that these words would sink into our soul and change us so that we could follow you with everything we are. And that we would see that you are our shield. You are our very great reward. It is in you we have our peace. Make that so in our lives. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.